Hi, everyone. First, I want to thank Christina and the Toyota Arts Council, as well as Cloudcroft Studios for finding creative solutions for bringing artists and the community together, even if we have to be virtual. And I'd also like to thank the judges for all of the time and energy and hard work that they put into judging all the work for this wonderful show. My name is Barbara Behrmann, and I'm based in Ithaca, New York. I'm primarily a fabric artist who primarily makes art quilts. And the reason I say primarily is because I also dabble in mixed media collage and acrylic paintings. Well, I'd like to first start by explaining what I mean by an art quilt. Because when people hear the word quilt, they often think of something that's very traditional, sometimes even old-fashioned, based on blocks. And you can see this here in the first quilt that I ever did, a traditional sampler quilt I did in 1997 for my daughter, who was then 3. She's now 26, so some time has passed. The colors aren't traditional, but you can see how the designs are. Art quilts, however, often don't resemble this at all, other than the fact that artists typically, but not always, use fabric and thread to hold together 2 or 3 or more layers. And then from there, we diverge in endless directions. So I would like to start by showing you a few examples of what I create, starting with where I create. I have a home-based studio in the woods, just south of Ithaca. And I work in a room that used to be known as the den or the family room, and I do still have to occasionally share it with family members, but I really like the fact that it's so accessible and integrated with the rest of my life. I'm one of 40 artists on the Greater Ithaca Art Trail, and for 2 weekends in October, we have open studio hours. This year's a little bit different, but this is the studio set up last year for the art trail. And you can see that there's different work surfaces. There's a place to paint, there's a place to cut fabric, there's a place to stitch, and storage underneath. But my favorite part of the studio is when you pivot just slightly to the right, and there's a 6x6 foot design wall. Right now it's got pieces on it that are either finished or in progress. But what's lovely about this design wall is that it lets you move fabrics around very easily without having to pin them in place. It's a lot like playing with the color forms that some of us played with when we were a lot younger. In case you think that the studio is always this organized, this is what it typically looks like when I'm working on a project. So let me show you some samples of some recent work and talk a little bit about the process of creating them. So I tend to work lately in one of 2 ways. And the first of these is very improvisational, always abstract. My starting point for these pieces is typically color and combinations of color and fabrics. And here are a couple of examples of what that might look like. So then I build the composition sort of from this point. And I often start by just taking a few fabrics and stitching them together kind of randomly, and making little miniature units like you see here. It might be 4 inches square up to 12 inches square. And I take these various units after I have a bunch of them, and I put them up on the design wall in a process that we sometimes fondly refer to as fabric barf. And you can see that here. And I end up moving these all around in dozens, if not hundreds of ways, and adding fabrics and taking things out and just trying to get the right balance. When this was all done, when it's all done, that's what it looks like. And you can see here it's finished and it's quilted. So let me just digress for a second to explain what I mean by that, because while I call this quilt a quilt, I also just said it's quilted, the action of a verb. Quilting is not the piecing process, which I just talked about, but it's actually what you do to sandwich layers together. The quilt top, as you see here, a backing fabric underneath it, and in between them, a thin layer of what's called batting, which adds a little bit of depth. And then you stitch through all those layers. And there are endless decisions that you can make in terms of how you want to quilt it. Hopefully the quilting that's used will enhance the design rather than take away from it. So I'm not going to talk about the quilting process anymore. I just wanted to mention that here to explain that that's part of the process that goes into making these pieces. So anyway, I described sort of the piecing process a little bit, but the past couple of years before that, I've started to make my own fabrics. And I do this by using fiber reactive dyes. Here is a slide of some of the pieces that I did this summer. Each piece is about a half yard to a whole yard, and everyone is completely different. And I use a bunch of different techniques, different resist techniques, applying paint directly, spreading dye through ice, all sorts of things. But each piece ends up being very unique, which when they're then cut and combined with other fabrics into larger compositions makes for a really one-of-a-kind piece. Well, the piece that won the award in the show this year for Best in Fiber is 7 o'clock. And this is a piece that I named because when I look at it, it kind of reminds me of the cacophony of sounds that people made every night at 7 o'clock during the earlier stages of the pandemic. And we wanted to show our support for frontline healthcare workers. And those two big vertical areas in the middle make me kind of think of high rises in New York City, and the smaller compositions surrounding it just are suggestive to me of sort of the chaos of urban life and the cacophony and craziness that you might hear. The gray fabric that you see running down the center on the right was made through a process called the resist process using flour paste, flour resist. And that's basically taking a mixture of water and flour and making a thin paste like pancake batter, and then spreading that thinly over the fabric, waiting for it to dry and harden, and then you crinkle it all up and spread it back open and scrape dye on top. Wherever there was a little crack or crevice in that paste, the dye will seep through and create that really cool effect. And here's another image of some of the fabrics that I made with that technique, with the exception of the purple one on the right that just found its way in the picture. That was done with wax instead. If you go back to the quilt, the red hot pink pieces that sort of make the left high-rise area, those are made with a process of directly applying the dye. And that's done where you take the dye powder, mix it with a little bit of water, mix it with this thickening agent that creates kind of a glutinous substance, and then you can spread that and stamp it and stencil and do all sorts of things with it onto the fabric. And you can see here what those fabrics looked like before they were cut up, and some of the other fabrics that I used in this piece as well. The pieces themselves may or may not look great as a whole, but when you cut them up and combine them, they do really fun things. Well, that is all that I want to say really about 7 o'clock, other than the fact that when I work improvisationally, as I did with this piece, I'm often left with a lot of leftover pieces and scraps, and I don't like to waste them. So sometimes what I'll do is use that as a starting point for another composition, which you can see here in this piece called Urban Village, which is also in the show. And you can see that there's some of the same fabrics that have been used in this one. And then I add to it to make the whole piece work. Well, I love color, as you can tell, I hope, but I also am really interested in just black and white and the dramatic contrast between them. So last year I made this small piece, just about a foot square, that looked very musical. I called it Jazzscape, and I got really great feedback on it. So I thought I would play with black and white compositions for a while. And this is the piece that's in the show this year. The black and white fabrics are all commercial. I did not make those. I did dye the pieces that are red and blue. And I just really love the movement and energy that's going on here. And then here's a couple of other pieces that I use the black and white as a starting point. Until now, all the pieces I've shown you have been based on process where I had no idea where I was going when I started, just starting with that color. But I often will use photos as an inspiration point as well. So I want to show you just two pieces to illustrate that. And this is the first one. I took this while hiking a couple years ago at Cascadilla Gorge, which runs from downtown Ithaca up through Cornell campus. You can clearly tell that I'm not a professional photographer, but I love the line, I love the movement, I love the shapes, and I thought that would make an interesting basis or a jumping off point for a quilt, or as it turned out to be, a pair of quilts. So here's the image. I sketched out some of the shapes on a small piece of paper, and then I enlarged it to a piece of foundation fabric, as you can see on the right, with the little drawings attached to them. And then I threw up some fabrics onto the wall that I thought might work well together to try to get some of those dark areas, and started building out the design on the right. You can see that here. This is what it looked like as I was working on it, one of many photos that I took along the way. And the finished piece looks like that. also behind me as I sit here now. So it's mostly, horizontal layers to represent the different strata of the rocks. There's vertical movement, which is sort of suggestive of water. And when you look at it closely, you can see, I hope, some of those quilting lines. On the left, it's again supposed to evoke the stratification in the rocks. And then on the right piece, you can also see, in addition to that, the vertical quilted lines is sort of suggestive of the water. The last major piece that I'll show you today is created through the same process that I used with Casca de la Gorge, where I started with a foundation fabric. It's based on a larger photo that I took of a cornfield. And then I cropped that picture, as you can see on the bottom right. That's just a segment of the larger picture. And I turned it into a black and white image so that I could really see the differences in values. And that was the basis for this piece. These are all fabrics that I dyed myself, with the exception of the gold piece and the dark bluish purple. Those were commercial. I've got so many other things I would love to share with you, which I'll hold off on for now. But I did want to point out that I also make table runners. It's one of the few functional things that I make. I make very small quilts, 4 by 6 inches, that I mount and frame in 8 by 10 frames. You can see that on the right. And I make greeting cards. I've got 50 designs that are little pullouts of larger quilts and projects that I have. I call them sneak peek packs. So those are also available. I would love to encourage you to visit my website, Art Quilts by Barb. I'm also on Instagram by the same name, Art Quilts by Barb, and on Facebook, a little bit different, Art Quilts and Acrylics by Barb. So I hope you'll check that out. If you're interested in my work, if you'd like to purchase a piece, if you just have questions, I would love to hear from you. And in the meantime, thank you so much for spending these few minutes with me. Stay safe and stay well, and I look forward to being able to visit in person. And bye for now.